Aloha no kako. This is Kenson Kuba coming to you from the island of Maui. Have you ever wondered what Jesus was like? What kind of man he was? That's going to be our objective as we study the Gospel of John. John is known as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And in his Gospel, he paints a picture of Jesus that is unlike any other. The other three Gospels see Jesus in a very similar way, and that's why they're called the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic is actually a compound word. Syn, like in the word synonym, is the same, and optic is like optics or seeing, and so they tend to see Jesus in the same or in a similar way. In fact, when you read those three Gospels, many of the stories are similar. Maybe different perspective, but they're the same stories. Well, when you come to the Gospel of John, this Gospel is totally different. Sometimes I wonder whether John had thought about writing a Gospel, but he had held off because he saw that there were the other three Gospels and he didn't feel the need to have a fourth Gospel that was similar. And so he held off. And this is my personal belief, is that he had a vision, and it is the one that he wrote about in the book of Revelation. And there he sees Jesus in a totally different way. If you read the book of Revelation, Jesus is in there, but Jesus is portrayed in his glorified form. In fact, when John first sees Jesus, he falls down on his face, and just in awe and in fear because of what Jesus is like now in the glorified Christ in heaven. And so when he writes his gospel, he writes about this glorified Jesus, the Jesus that not only walked this earth and ministered, but the Jesus who is from eternity past, the Jesus who is the divine one, God himself come in the flesh. And so because he saw Christ in both his earthly ministry and now in his heavenly state of glory, he writes his gospel from a new perspective. And that's why he begins his gospel not at his birth as in Matthew and Luke's account, nor at the beginning of his ministry at the baptism as Mark does, but John begins his gospel in eternity past because he wants to bring the true nature of Christ into the picture. And so we're going to begin this series of studies, with the first chapter. And we're going to look at that primarily as an introduction before we look at the person of Christ and his earthly ministry. So let's go to the chapter 1 of his gospel and let's look at what he says there. And there we have these verses. We're going to look at verses 1 to 5. I might break these up in different videos because it might be long. And then we're also going to attach to that verse 14. So let me read these 6 verses right here. John writes, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." Amen. Well, let's go back to verse 1, and let's look at what John is saying. He starts his gospel off with these words, "In the beginning." Now, when I say those 3 words, what comes to your mind? I bet you're saying the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And that's what comes to my mind as well. These 3 words, in the beginning, were not unfamiliar to the readers. What I learned in the Bible college was that this gospel was written primarily to the Greek or the Gentile Christians. But I think John was also writing to the Jewish Christians because the Jewish Christians, the ones who were familiar with the Old Testament, when they saw these words, it would bring to their memory the words of Genesis 1:1. And there, of course, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And here John begins his gospel, in the beginning was the Word. And John wants to equate this with Genesis 1:1 because he is trying to paint a picture of Jesus as the creator of the universe, as the one who spoke the words, and through his words, the universe and all things were created. In fact, let me go and show you uh, the Gospel of John in the Greek interlinear, and to make this point clearer. Here you see the Greek as well as the English translation of the Greek words. And you see the words in the beginning is a translation of the Greek words on arche. And so there's just two Greek words here. In, arche, A-R-C-H-E, in beginning. There actually is not this word right here. We have the definite article in the English, which the translators included because if you didn't include this, it would sound a bit awkward. In beginning, that doesn't sound quite right. So they said in the beginning, even though that word is not found here. You can see. But this word arche is a word that you're familiar with. Arche can be, we have English words such as archetype, which means the original model, the original type that we're following. Or the word archaeology, which is the study of the origins or the study of the beginnings. Or as if you've seen the movies, Indiana Jones, he's always studying things that are from the ancient past. And that's what this word means, arche. And so we have in the Greek on arche. Now the Old Testament, of course, is written in Hebrew as well as Aramaic. But back about 2 centuries BC, there was made a translation of the Old Testament into the Greek language. It was made by Ptolemy, who wanted to include the Old Testament in his library in Alexandria. And so he brought together 70 or 72 Jewish scholars, and he gave them the commission to translate the Old Testament into the Greek language, to include it in his library, and to make it available to the common people because people were beginning to speak Greek more than Hebrew. In fact, by that time already, Hebrew had become more of a liturgical language and not as a common language of the people. Not unlike Latin today is used in certain Catholic mass and worship, but is not spoken anymore. So the Hebrew of those days had become like Latin of today, a language used for religious observance, but not in everyday speech. The common language of speaking would have been Greek as well as Aramaic. And so let's look at the Greek translation that they came out with. And this is the Septuagint right here. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, we read, in the beginning, on arche. Did you notice? It is exactly as John wrote it. And John, I believe, did this on purpose because he wanted to allude back to this book so that people could remember this verse, speaking about the God and creator of the universe, and equate it to the word. When you read or you hear of certain quotes such as "to be or not to be," if I quoted that, what would you think of? Of course, you'd think of Hamlet. Or if I said it was the best of times and the worst of times, what would you think of? You would think of Charles Dickens' book, The Tale of Two Cities. And this is the same thing that John does. He uses this quote in a way to have people remember the creation story and God. And so that is one reason I believe John's gospel is so different, is he begins really from the very beginning, before anything was created. John wants to make the case that the Word was there. Okay, let's get back to the verse. He says, in the beginning was the Word. Some people would say, well, maybe the Word was created in the beginning as well. No, So that's eliminated because this verb was is in the imperfect tense, and that is speaking of the word always existing. It's already existing in the beginning and always was. And he goes on to say, and the word was with God. Not only was the word existing, but the word was existing eternally with God. This word in the Greek is the word pros. The normal word for with may be pro, but he writes pros, which is a more emphatic word. And so he's saying, he's speaking of the word not only being in the presence of God, but being face to face with God. So he's drawing an intimate relationship between the Word, who is eternally in the beginning, and God himself. And then he goes on in the third phrase of verse 1, and the Word was God. So not only was the Word with God, but the Word was God. Maybe you've heard of a translation called the New World Translation, which is used by the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they don't have it like this. In their version, they've included this, and the word was a small g, God. Now the question is this correct as a translation? And to answer that, let's go back to our interlinear, and let's see what this the Greek says. On arche, in the beginning, on ho logos was the word, kai and ho logos, and the word on pros. Remember I said this word pros with, it was emphatic. Ton theon, and the word was with God. You notice in here the word God is prefaced with this definite article. This means the God, ton theon. But it's not written in the English. They leave the word the out. It's interesting because they added the word the here and it's not there in the Greek. They don't add the word the here and it is in the Greek. I'm going to explain to you why that is later. And this is the last phrase, theos, God, on ho logos, was the word. Here you have the definite article again, ho logos. And God was the word. Did you notice something interesting? And it is the syntax. It's the orders of the order of the words. Here you have and the word was with the God, and God was the word. Now, wouldn't you have thought that John would have written and the word was God? He doesn't write that. He puts God in the beginning of this phrase. Why does he do that? Because in the Greek, as in many other languages, to add emphasis to a word in a phrase, you can put it in the beginning of the phrase. If you come to Hawaii, we speak a pidgin English in Hawaii, and many tourists come here, and the local people are speaking this pidgin, and the tourists are wondering what the heck are they saying, because it even though it uses English words, it is spoken in a way that it makes it more difficult to understand. In the pidgin English in Hawaii, if we're walking down the street and we see a mansion, this huge mansion, and I want to say something about how large that mansion is, I will say, "Oh, the house, they big." That would be the pidgin. If I wanted to really emphasize how large the house was, I would not just say, "Oh, the house, they big." I would say, "Oh, big the house." I would take the word big and I would put it in front of the word house. And that way it would emphasize how large the house was. And that's kind of what John does here. He wants to make the point that the word was on theos, God. And so what he does he doesn't just say, and the word was God. He says, and God was the word. And by doing that, he's emphasizing the fact that the word is God himself. And so let's come back to the English. So the English translators have turned it, the Word was God, because in the English it doesn't sound good to say, and God was the Word. We usually don't flip words like that unless you're Yoda. But so what I'm trying to say is that would it be proper to put an A in front of God? Well, you could, because in the Greek there is no indefinite article. And in fact, if the Greeks wanted to write a God, they would leave out the definite article the, and they would just put the word God there. But how do you know whether you should put an A in front of God or not? Well, the answer is you look at the context of this passage. And if you look at the context, you will discover whether this word God should have an indefinite article in front of it. If you put the indefinite article in front of this word, and I've always thought this strange that they do that, then you have basically two gods. You have the one with the capital G, and then you have the one with the small g, and which makes it odd because in the scriptures we are told to worship Jesus. In fact, God Himself in the book of Hebrews commands His angels to worship His Son. And yet in the Ten Commandments, it is spoken there in the first commandment, thou shalt not have any gods before me. And in fact, Jesus said in His temptation when Satan tempted Him, thou shalt not serve any God and worship any God except God alone. Or, so there is only one God that we should worship, and it is the true God. If you have Jesus as being a God, it doesn't make sense that God would ask His angels to worship Jesus if He's only a God. Now, how do we know that He is the God? It's because, as I showed in the Greek, that the word theos, God, is in the beginning of this phrase, and that John wanted to emphasize the fact that the Word was God. And he does that again by putting the word God in the front. And so he reiterates and he repeats this whole truth. The same. Who is the same? The same is the Word was in the beginning with God. And he says this whole thing again, he just summarizes it with verse 2 right here. I'm going to just end this recording right now, and I want you to pick up the lesson in the next video. And we're going to go to verse 3, and I'm going to show you why, again, this word God should not be written with a lowercase g, nor with an indefinite article in front of it, because we're going to look at the context of verse 1 in the next video. We'll see you then.